You may not be seeing tanks crossing borders right now, but behind the scenes, Europe is preparing for a new conflict, and it's not any conflict. The threat has name and address: Vladimir Putin. While citizens live their routines normally, European Union political leaders are approving plans that can determine the survival of millions. And we are not talking about theory or speculation. On July 9, 2025, the European Commission approved an emergency plan that resembles the darkest days of the Cold War. A plan that goes beyond diplomacy. It involves strategic storage of food, medicine, water, military equipment, energy, and even antidotes against chemical and nuclear attacks. All with one goal: to prepare the continent for the worst. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Europe has been forced to face its weaknesses. Failures in the supply chain, energy dependence on Russia, and the absence of effective collective defense made it clear the continent is not prepared for a prolonged confrontation. And if Russia wins or goes out with some advantage of the Ukraine war, the risk of a new offensive toward the West becomes frighteningly real. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen made this clear. If Putin gets an advantageous ceasefire within 4 to 5 years, he could reconstruct his armed forces and represent an even greater threat. The warning is serious and echoes throughout Europe. For many analysts, Putin not only wants war, he needs it. The Russian economy was completely militarized. Civil industries gave way to war production, and more than 1 million men live immersed in a reality of conflict. Closing the war would mean facing the trauma of these combatants, paying compensation, rebuilding the civil economy, and facing a frustrated population. The social and economic cost of returning to peace is simply too high for the regime. Therefore, the logic is perverse. To keep Russia running, Putin needs an enemy, and Europe is the next most likely target. And who's in the target? Analysts point to the Balticos, Finland, Sweden, and Poland. Regions with strategic geographical positions, vulnerable borders, and complicated stories with Moscow. If Putin wins in Ukraine, these areas may be next. And meanwhile, the United States, under a leadership that prioritizes internal interests, show less and less interest in getting involved in European conflicts. With Donald Trump resurfaced on the political scene, signs of removal intensify. The old transatlantic alliance that supported Europe for decades may not resist another crisis. In this context, Europe has realized that it can no longer depend on allies. You need to be ready to act on your own. And that is why the European Commission created a new mass storage strategy. The plan is divided into 3 fronts: short-term, medium, and long-term. In the short term, the focus is on civil survival. Families should be able to survive autonomously for at least 72 hours in case of collapse, including non-perishable food, drinking water, basic medications, and alternative energy sources such as generators and solar panels. This minimum self-sufficiency is the initial defense line against panic and social collapse, which could be caused by hybrid attacks, energy cuts, or direct invasions. The message is clear. It is not just about preparing armies. It is about preparing each citizen, each home, to resist the first impacts of a possible attack. This change of mindset shows that Europe is taking the threat seriously, and that this time it does not expect to be taken by surprise. But this is just the beginning. If preparing for the first 72 hours of a crisis is essential, and after that, what happens when the stock of the civilian population ends? What if the war lasts weeks, months, or even years? Europe knows that, in this case, depending on household stocks, it is not enough. This is why the plan approved by the European Commission goes beyond the basics. It deepens in the second stage of survival: strategic industrial autonomy. This means ensuring that Europe has direct access and control over critical raw materials for its defense industry, and that these resources are protected from sabotage and direct attacks. Among the items that enter this middle stage are rare lands, special metals, electronic components, strategic fuels, and even submarine communication cables. All of this will be stored in logistics centers spread across secure regions of the continent. But that's not all. These centers will be highly protected and, whenever possible, duplicated in alternative places, making it difficult for a single Russian attack to collapse throughout the supply chain. The logic is simple: dispersing to survive. And we are not talking about conspiracy theory. During the years of conflict with Ukraine, Russia demonstrated a frightening ability to perform hybrid attacks, those that mix conventional military actions with digital sabotage, energy cuts, chemical or biological attacks, and misinformation campaigns. A blackout caused by a missile released against an electric plant can be as destructive as a bomb. A cyber attack can paralyze hospitals and water supply systems. Therefore, Europe now considers everything as a target, and everything as vulnerable. It is in this scenario that comes the role of medical contracted. Antibiotics, antidotes, decontamination kits, and even iodine pills, used in cases of exposure to nuclear radiation, now part of the European Union's civil arsenal. The priority is clear: save lives, maintain order, and ensure that urban centers do not collapse in case of attack. All of this is a direct consequence of what was observed in the Ukraine war. Bombarded hospitals, intoxicated civilians, scarcity of basic medicines, hard-learned lessons. But all this effort is expensive, very expensive. It is estimated that just to keep these strategic stocks running and prepare the continent for a medium to long-term war, Europe would need at least 500 billion euros in extra investments. It is a gigantic value that goes beyond the annual defense budgets of almost all European countries added. Where would this money come from? One of the most discussed proposals is to use part of the 300 billion euros in frozen Russian actives in Europe since the beginning of the war. These resources, which belong to banks, oligarchs, and Russian state companies, could be relocated to finance the reconstruction of European security. Symbolism is strong, using Putin's money against himself. Of course, the measure is controversial and faces legal and political resistance. But in the face of the real threat of a war in the heart of Europe, even the taboos begin to be broken. In addition to stocks and money, there is an even deeper change happening. Europe begins to move to a preventive war mode of economy. This means reorienting the civil industry so that, in times of need, it can be quickly converted to produce essential equipment. From ammunition and weapons to canned food, thermal clothing, portable shelters, and medical kits. It is an effort for production to continue even under pressure, bombing, or shortage of imported resources. The goal is to avoid what happened to Ukraine, which at the beginning of the conflict depended on third parties to supply its front line and its cities besieged. All of this is done with a final goal: to ensure that Europe is not taken by surprise, as it was in 2022. That no longer needs to react in panic, running after makeshift solutions. The idea now is to anticipate the worst and ensure that, even in a total attack scenario, the continent can resist, reorganize, and counterattack. But there is still one last and fundamental element in this equation: time. How long does Europe have before Putin make his next movement? How long until any victory or ceasefire in Ukraine release Russian troops to other fronts? These are questions that no one can answer accurately. And for that very reason, the next step of the European plan can be the most important of all. The European Commission has approved a strategic plan to stock up on catastrophic essential supplies and possible wars, with a special focus on Russia's threat under Vladimir Putin. The plan includes 3 inventory categories: short-term, medium, and long-term. Each of these phases responds to a specific step of a possible conflict, always in order to ensure that the continent is not surprised, not paralyzed, in the face of a new military climb. In the short term, as we have seen, the priority is the survival of the civilian population in the first 3 days of crisis. Food, water, medicines, portable energy, and emergency communication make up the core of this plan. The European Commission recommends that each European home will be able to survive independently for 72 hours, the minimum time required for authorities to mobilize the resources stored centrally. Generators, solar panels, power banks, and water purifiers leave the universe of alternative preparation and enter the official security lists. In the medium term, the focus changes to critical raw materials, those that are essential to the war industry and, if they are missing, paralyze the entire production chain. Items such as rare lands, strategic metals, electronic components, fiber optic cables, fuels, and industrial chemicals are considered as important as tanks and missiles. Europe aims to build storage centers in strategically protected and dispersed places to prevent a single attack from destroying its replacement capacity. It is about creating industrial resilience in the face of a total war. Finally, in the long run, the boldest and most sensitive concept of the plan comes into action: continuous industrial preparation for prolonged war times. The idea is that the European industry not only reacts to the conflict, but is ready to operate even under extreme conditions: bombing, shortage of inputs, logistics blocks. This means adapting factories so that they can switch between civil and military production quickly. It means ensuring that foods, medicines, clothing, and ammunition can continue to be produced even with closed borders and interrupted outdoor supply chains. Stocked items, therefore, cover from basic supplies to highly specialized military equipment such as broad-spectrum antibiotics, chemical antidotes, nuclear decontamination kits, observation drones, moving bridges, high-power generators, and repair cables for underground infrastructure. All of these items have double application, civil and military, which expands their strategic importance. The main motivation for all this is the war in Ukraine, which began by Russia in 2022, which opened the European weaknesses. Russian gas dependence, lack of strategic stocks, and slowness in answers exposed the continent as vulnerable. And if Russia comes out victorious or with any advantage, the scenario can be repeated on an even greater scale. European leaders fear that a Russian victory give Putin the internal legitimacy needed to reorganize his army, renew his arsenal, and target new targets. And the fear is that this happens in just 4 or 5 years. To make matters worse, Europe also observes with concern the removal of the United States, especially under the influence of Donald Trump, who has already given clear signs that he does not see NATO as a priority. If Americans decide not to intervene, the continent may have to fight alone for their survival. Analysts believe the Russian economy is so militarized that, to continue working, it needs war. Peace would require deep reforms, return of civil soldiers, pensions, social recovery, all very expensive and politically dangerous for the Putin regime. In other words, war is the natural way of functioning of today's Russia. Regions more vulnerable to possible attacks include the Baltic, Finland, Sweden, and Poland, countries that, if invaded, can put the entire European structure collapsed. An attack not only territorial, but also psychological, energetic, digital, and biological. Therefore, the European Commission does not only want to prepare governments, but also the population. She recommends that each citizen understand the risks and organize with a basic stock. Cleated foods, common drugs, drinking water, lanterns, batteries, simple items that can make the difference between chaos and survival in the early hours of an attack. What about the financial part? The most concrete proposal is to use up to 300 billion euros in frozen Russian assets in European territory. This amount, combined with investments from the member countries, would form the basis of an estimated emergency defense fund at 500 billion euros. A huge value, but proportional to the threat. This strategy marks a change of mindset. Europe is no longer reactive to become proactive. Instead of waiting for the next attack, she prepares to face it before it happens. Because in the world of Vladimir Putin, peace is just a break between the wars. And who wants to survive will have to be ready for the worst, always.